The Westward Eye is a gothic horror audio drama. Mature themes and gore are present. Listener discretion is advised. Episode-specific trigger warnings can be found in the description. Thank you. Somewhere that may have existed long ago, or perhaps is still to come, lies a place isolated from the rest of civilization, known as the West, where lost communities perform ancient traditions, old gods pry themselves from the earth, and monstrous creatures lurk in the darkness.
My fellow students, I don't feel like it's a reach to say that these last 4 years at university have been some of the most challenging but rewarding years of our lives. It has been an immense privilege to work and grow alongside you all. The East has had its fair share of struggles. 250 years ago, almost to the day, the East removed itself from the West. The canyon that separated us grew wider, and the weather became more hostile. Although the West provided us with minerals and farmed food, it was no longer viable for us to maintain a connection with its colonies. For the corporations in power, the decision must have been a scary one, as they wondered what the future would hold for the East. But I know in my heart they'd be overjoyed to see how far their Eastern descendants have come. Since the industrial boom, things here have been better than ever, and I'm so proud of us. But the work is still not done. The connections we made and our efforts will continue to impact the East for generations to come. It's bittersweet standing up here, looking at you, my classmates, remembering all of our time together, from the collective cramming for a final to study breaks in the union. We pushed each other to change, to grow, and to be people that our families can look at with satisfaction. Moreover, I know that each and every one of you standing before me has made their corporate sponsor proud. Higher education would not be possible without their generous contribution to our academic success, and to them, we are eternally grateful. I would also like to use this time to thank my sponsor, Locke Corporation. They saw my potential when no one else did. They supported my passion for anthropology and human civilizations, and I am beyond thrilled to begin my 40 years of repay work with them. They saw my passion for exploration as a virtue, rather than a vice, as something to strive for, rather than something that would ultimately get in my way. My name is Tobin Clade, and as your valedictorian, I would like to thank the Polter Institute for shaping us into who we are today, and to wish us all luck on the adventures that life may bring our way.
Tobin basked in his fellow students' applause, the heat of the theater lights beating down on him. After a moment, he exited the stage and made a point to quickly maneuver his way to the back of the auditorium, giving strange smiles to all those who congratulated him as he passed. Silence welcomed him as he entered the vacant hallway beyond the large celebration hall. He turned, leaning hard into the wall nearest to him. His deep maroon suit that had been perfectly fitted a few days prior suddenly began to restrict, pressing into his ribs with every inhale. Tobin could hear his strained breaths echo down the hall as he tried to calm down, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Despite what people assumed to be natural charisma, public speaking had never been Tobin's strong suit. He was much more accustomed to research and quiet study. To him, the serene bliss of a library in the early hours of the morning far surpassed that of a crowded party.
Tobin!
The large wooden door to Tobin's left cracked open ever so slightly, revealing a young woman, Etta Flynn. Tobin's classmate and best friend emerged in the hallway, wearing a lilac dress that draped gently over her figure. Its low-cut neckline framed her collarbones. It was customary for graduates to wear gowns on their last day, but both Tobin and Etta had opted out. However, that didn't stop them from appearing their best. Tobin had combed his short hair back, holding it in place with an unnecessary amount of hair gel, while Etta had fashioned her brown curls in an intricate braid that managed to reach just below her shoulders. She smiled at Tobin.
Etta, you can't be back here. This part of the university is closed for graduation.
Shh, it's fine. What are they going to do? Expel me? And, by the way, you're here too.
Well, you have me there.
Disrupting class, derailing discussions, my grades. It's not like they didn't try, but my sponsorship from LCA News isn't something they could ignore.
Are you still thinking about going into journalism?
It's not like I can change my mind now. After our plans, of course.
Be honest. How did I do?
Are you kidding? You did great. Really sucked up to Lot Corp.
I know, it's just...
Etta moved towards Tobin, stopping directly in front of him, her brown eyes gently gazing into his own. She'd always been taller than Tobin, which she teased him mercilessly for, although he never seemed to mind. She smiled at him before reaching up and gently pulling off his round glasses and cleaning them with the fabric of her dress.
Tobin, don't worry about it. You already have an expedition lined up, yes. It's going to pay off at least half of what you owe.
What if nothing's out there?
People will pay good money to know, to answer that what if. And, with me documenting the experience, there's no way we won't get published.
Etta placed Tobin's glasses back on his face. She smiled and playfully poked one of the larger freckles that patterned his pale cheeks.
Yes, you're right. As always.
And that's I am.
Are my parents out there?
Yes. Your dad is looking for you.
Of course he is.
A knowing grin was shared between them as Tobin gathered himself, buttoning his suit coat and dusting himself off. Once he was ready, Etta offered her arm, and the two, elbows linked, left the hallway and returned to the now bustling auditorium. The auditorium was certainly fit for such a crowd, the ceilings reaching nearly 100 feet tall with deep maroon and gold banners hanging down all sides. The scene was one of immense wealth, with families and the social elite dressed in their finest silks and furs. From the fringes of the crowd, all the people swirled together into a sea of intricate silvery detail mingled with bold blocks of color. The pair held tighter to each other as they navigated the loud drove until finally they spotted a balding man with his arms wide open, Mr. Clade.
There you are. I'm so proud of you. Your academic achievement is no small feat. It's not every day that one such as yourself
Thank you, Dad.
made your sponsor proud. What are you planning to do next?
Next?
I have something in the works.
It's our graduation. Can't we just enjoy it before...
Etta, it's nice to see that you graduated at all. Your mother filled me in on your struggles.
Dad!
Mr. Clade shot his son a harsh, familiar look.
Tobin, he's really not worth it. And we have more important things to do anyway. Let's just go.
Yes.
Excuse me, son. Where do you think you're going?
As Tobin and Etta moved to leave, Mr. Clade stepped to block their path. Graduates and their families wove around him, paying little notice to the unfolding conflict.
I'll see you tonight, Dad.
Mr. Clade did little more to protest as Tobin and Etta slipped past him and disappeared into the dense crowd. Tobin fought the urge to look back at his father. He elected instead to focus on Etta. Her hand clasped firm around his as she guided him away. The two finally broke free from the auditorium and began making their way to the front of the building, footsteps echoing throughout the empty halls. They both struggled in vain to break the silence, the heat of the encounter still weighing in the air between them. A large marble staircase led them down to the vast city below. Once reaching the sidewalk, the two's hands released, falling to their sides. They stood for a quiet moment before Tobin finally spoke.
I'm so sorry about him, Etta.
Well, I'm used to it.
Still, he's just always like this.
Do you think you're going to tell him about the expedition?
Did you tell your parents?
Fair point.
I don't know. I mean, everything I've done has been about him. University, my summer internships, LogCorp, all of it. I just want something that's mine, you know? And besides, I already know what he'd say.
And what would that be?
He'd say that going on an expedition to the West is a bad idea that will just end up getting me killed. That it's illegal, and even though LogCorp is sponsoring it, that I am too smart to be making a decision this stupid.
Etta recognized the familiar hurt in Tobin's eyes, the forever longing of his father's approval, the doubt in himself. She knew that feeling of insecurity all too well.
So why are we doing it? What's the point of going to the West? Doing something that is illegal, irrational, and likely to get us arrested?
Because no one else will.
Tobin stared off into the distance. Cresting over the willow trees in front of them was the towering wall that separated the east from the west. Its looming presence had become little more than an afterthought in the past few decades, leaving the residents of the east in a place of docility.
Oh, that's our ride.
Swerving up the congested roads, a large black car approached them with alarming speed and screeched to a halt in front of Tobin and Etta. The chauffeur looked tired as he exited his car and made his way over to their side, opening the rear door without so much as a word or glance in their direction. Etta eyed him cautiously, but nonetheless slid into the back seat, quickly followed by Tobin. The door slammed behind them, and the pair waited with a sense of anticipation as the driver got back into his seat and started the car. There was a long pause before the man turned to face them, his eyebrows raised expectantly. Tobin sat for a moment, confused by this silent cue, then quickly realized he needed the address. Tobin fumbled through his pockets for the piece of paper he had scribbled it on earlier and stammered aloud.
639 Oakview Drive. And could you raise the partition, please?
The driver let out a deep sigh and muttered something under his breath before pressing a button near the steering wheel. The partition rose, and the moment it closed, sparing them privacy, Etta snorted out a laugh. Tobin shot her a glare for it, but couldn't hide his creeping smile. The car jolted into motion, peeling off from the curbside. Although it was panning out to be a chaotic drive, the two tried their best to settle into their seats. A few minutes passed before Etta spoke.
Do you think they'll agree to come with us?
They have to.
Tobin turned to look out the window, lost in thought as the car passed through the metropolitan cityscape. He watched as crowds rushed by bustling storefronts in fitted suits and designer brands. Adults walked with purpose and business in their step, while flocks of youth laughed loudly as they window shopped. The sound of their laughter slowly faded as the car left the city limits. The further they moved west, the less people seemed to have. Homes got smaller and smaller, and the sidewalks were scattered with makeshift shelters. There was a notable slowness as workers trudged home, covered in the day's grime. The buzz that kept the eastern coast of the city alive seemed to have all but died out, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. It occurred to Tobin that people here didn't live. They survived.
I didn't know Sterling lived so far west.
It was hard to track them down. You know, they didn't talk much about themselves in primary.
Maybe we just didn't ask.
Well, you know how off-put they'd get when we brought up their home life. You know, now that I think of it, they were pretty quiet most of the time.
Tobin and Etta fell back into silence as the car continued. They watched out the window as the cramped sidewalk slowly gave way to gravel and dirt roads. Fields and farms taking the place of rundown buildings. The car slowed and turned down a muddy road. Tobin strained his neck and looked forward to see a small farmhouse surrounded by fields.
So much for being inconspicuous.
Is it weird that I'm nervous?
Aren't you always?
Oh, no, not like this. Well, now's as good a time as any. Sterling, they don't know that we're coming.
Tobin! I thought that...
In order to get an expedition grant, I needed to prove to the board that we had a reliable way to cross the wall. And I did. I mentioned Sterling. I was vague on what they knew, but there's no way they'd refuse. They were our friend, after all, and we would do the same for them.
For both our sakes, I hope you're right.
The driver came to an abrupt halt in front of a lonesome farmhouse, jolting the two hard into their seatbelts. Tobin made an audible grunt in response and was sure to quickly exit the car with Etta on his tail. Just as the door closed behind them, the driver's window rolled down with an open palm extended out. This time, Tobin understood what he wanted. Money was his language after all, and flipped a couple bills in the man's hand. Before they could exchange another word, the window closed and the car peeled off back up the one-way road, mud splashing out from its tires. Tobin attempted to wave him off before letting his hand fall in defeat. He turned to face the small house. The walls brandished an old coat of peeling blue paint. Tobin hadn't prepared for an outcome without Sterling and refused to entertain the thought. The plan had to work. With a deep breath, he took the lead and approached the house's brittle screen door.
Hello? Pardon the intrusion, but we're friends of Sterling. We went to primary together. I was told they lived here.
Are you sure this is the right home? This place looks vacant.
This was their most recent address.
Maybe the driver messed up?
Tobin gestured to the metal numbers next to the door. 639. The rusty orange color against the faded blue paint reminded Tobin of the sun on a particularly smoggy day. Etta gave Tobin a concerned look, realizing how little her partner had thought this through. Tobin knocked on the door several times, growing more and more impatient. They had to be here.
Tobin, no one's home.
Not paying Etta any mind, Tobin hastily moved to the side of the house and began peering through a window, looking into a modest dining room. While the outside of the home appeared rather run down, the interior was oddly tidy. Hand-stitched cloths draped over a circular table at the center of the space, and upon it rested a bowl of bruised fruits.
What are you doing? Do you want to get shot?
Relax, Etta. Clearly no one's home.
Etta watched his face fall as he backed away from the house and returned to the driveway. For as long as she'd known Tobin, he had always struggled when things didn't go exactly to his plan.
Hey, they could still be here. It's the middle of the day. They're probably out in the fields working.
You're right. Yes, sorry, yes. Let's just look around.
Tobin's confidence was quick to return with the reassurance of his friend. The two turned to scan the vast field stretching out beyond the house. It spread a good 10 acres and consisted of sprouting wheat with small gardens dug throughout. The closest one was only a few feet away and was one of the largest. It displayed a grand harvest with plentiful amounts of greenery growing from the thick vines and various posts. Both Etta and Tobin stared in awe, having never seen so much natural vegetation in their lives.
I always forget there are still people who grow food outside. It's such a waste of water. Does anyone even still buy this?
People will pay a fortune for nostalgia. And besides, my father says the lab-grown stuff doesn't have the same flavor. Do you know what any of it is?
Etta knew this was more of a quiz on her memory rather than a genuine question, and approached the garden to get a closer look. She crouched down beside the nearest post and assessed the vibrant crop. Their bold colors fixated her gaze, and she admired their various shades of sweet greens to the most bright red. Etta knew they were tomatoes, but had never seen one still ripe on the vine.
Well, these are tomatoes.
Ugh, I don't know if you're right.
What? Of course I am.
Tobin lowered to the ground beside his companion, and without a moment's hesitation, plucked an emerald tomato from the vine.
Tobin!
Yes, no, definitely not. This is what you call a vegetable, Etta.
Oh, right. Nice one, scholar.
Tobin laughed more at himself than at his sarcasm, and tossed the tomato to the ground. He stood and brushed the soil off his pants. While doing so, something caught his eye, a sharp light that glared at the corner of his vision. When he turned to find the source, he spotted what looked like a large structure at the far end of the fields.
A glass house.
What?
Without responding, Tobin took off towards the back of the field, and Etta scrambled to her feet in order to catch up with him. It took them about 3 minutes trekking through the sprouting wheat before arriving at the greenhouse. The structure was smaller than they had expected, and foliage grew so tall inside, it made it hard to see in, despite its transparent walls. Tobin strained his eyes to get a better look and identified a couple of things, from boxes overflowing with greens, large trees speckled in yellow and orange dots, and a person crouched over a basket. Instinctively, Tobin's hand clasped around Etta's, quickly pulling her with him into a crouched position.
Do you think it's Sterling? Tobin.
I don't know. It could be.
I mean, we haven't seen them since we were what? 12?
At the oldest.
Tobin and Etta fell silent as the figure's head snapped to face them. Slowly, the person stood up and began walking towards where the two were hidden. Fear welled up in Tobin as he realized what could become of them. There was a reason why people from the farmlands never got university sponsors, or little much of anything. It seemed as though the closer people got to the Western Wall, the more dangerous they'd become.
Hello? Hello? I know you're out there, and if you know what's best for you, you'll show yourselves. I'm gonna make my way out of here, and if you try to run, which I suggest you don't, things won't go well for you. Understand? Understand?
Yes.
We understand.
Reluctantly, Tobin and Etta rounded the side of the greenhouse and found themselves face to face with a splintering wooden door. Much like the main house, it was clear that this was falling apart. Many of the glass wall panels sat cracked or entirely missing, and the door seemed to be held onto its frame with little more than a twisted wire cord. The figure in the greenhouse inched closer, and Tobin could feel his breath catch in his throat. Closer, closer, until their shadow cast on the door, looming a good 9 inches over Tobin's head.
My name is Tobin. I'm with my associate, Etta, and we're here to see Sterling. We were friends back in primary. If you know where they are, it would be greatly appreciated. And we can compensate you for your troubles.
Now what makes you think Sterling wants anything to do with y'all?
Honestly, we don't know. It's been ages since we spoke. But we were close. Once. And that has to count for something.
Ever so slightly, the door to the greenhouse cracked open with the sound of metal grinding against itself. Tobin felt frozen in place and glanced to Etta for an ounce of confidence, but she only reflected the same breath of fear. The two braced for the worst as the old door groaned its way open.
I'm surprised you wanted to come all the way to the wall. Not enough to keep y'all entertained at your fancy university?
If they had been strangers passing on the street, Tobin wouldn't have recognized Sterling. Their nose was crooked, and their face was covered in pale scars. Their once short black hair now flowed like oil from underneath the brim of their Stetson hat, ending past their shoulders. Their frail frame had filled out as they fit quite nicely into their dark brown button-up. The only thing that seemed familiar to Tobin was their eyes, the color of fog in the early morning that seemed to glow under the shadow of their hat.
Tobin.
Their old friend looked Tobin up and down, slowly scanning up his body.
What do you want?
We have a proposal for you.
Not interested.
Please, hear us out. We don't need much of your time, and we're very sorry for intruding on your family's land.
This isn't my land. We work here.
Then I really think you'd like to hear what we're offering.
Sterling stood silent, their cold gaze shifting from Tobin to Etta. Tobin couldn't help but feel a little intimidated seeing their old friend after all those years. Even as a child, Sterling had been cold, standoffish, unusual. The quiet type who would rather observe a conversation than actively participate, watching from the corner with their icy eyes.
I'm here to discuss a sort of business opportunity. I've been sponsored by LockCorp to lead an expedition. They allowed for myself and 2 others to record testimonials and document stories that could answer century-long questions. They offered financial compensation, of course, for all of us. Etta was brought on to journal and document the adventure, and, well, we were hoping you could act as our guide.
And where would I be guiding you?
Beyond the wall? Out west?
Wow, you two really are crazy. What's that university been filling your heads with?
Sterling, when we were kids, you said...
There's no way to get to the west. Y'all know that. What I said when I was a kid was wrong. Kids, they lie.
But you never did. Even when you got reprimanded for sneaking out of class, you always took accountability and told the truth.
There is no way to get to the west.
Then where is your family from? If it's not the story you told us, where were your parents born? Where were you before we met in primary? I am not asking for your help for free. I know we haven't earned that. But I am offering to pay you enough to make sure you and your family can get off this farm. Hell, with your cut of the money, you can buy your own. Easy.
What exactly are you implying?
I'm saying that...
There's nothing wrong with working for your money. I know it's not something you'd understand, but we do things differently this close to the wall.
Just, please, hear me out.
Without breaking eye contact, Tobin slowly unbuttoned his maroon suit jacket. He pulled out a thick envelope and passed it to Sterling.
Half up front, half after you make sure Etta and I get back to the east safely.
Sterling picked at the adhesive and peeled open the envelope. Tobin and Etta watched as a look of disbelief flashed across their face. Only for a moment.
I'd like to get going sooner rather than later.
We planned for tomorrow at dawn.
I know it's short notice, but for what we're offering you, it doesn't seem like much to ask.
Sterling stood silently, transfixed by the money in their hand. A life-changing, life-saving amount. Rejecting it would be near impossible. But getting to the West would cost them a lot more than a few wads of cash. Tobin and Etta watched silently. The sun had just begun to lower itself into the western half of the sky. Time was passing with every second they spent there, waiting for Sterling to weigh their options.
This is only half.
Yes.
And I'd get the rest when we got back.
Yes.
Leaving at dawn isn't an option. With the surveillance around the wall the way that it is, there's no way we'd even get close in the daylight.
We really shouldn't be pushing it back. I have a plan for...
Which is why we have to leave tonight. Midnight, maybe 0100. Meet me at 46th and Eunice. There's an old brick house there that no one lives in anymore. It's as close as we can get to the wall without being seen as a cause for concern.
Thank you.
Don't. I'm not doing you a favor here. All I care about is this.
Sterling gestured to the envelope before stuffing it deep into their pants pocket.
Now, I have a job to get back to, so I'd appreciate it if you got going. 0100, 46 and Eunice. Don't make me regret this. And don't be late.
Without another word, Sterling turned and walked back into the greenhouse, the makeshift door creaking closed behind them. Etta turned her attention to Tobin. He looked back at her as a smile crept slowly across his face. The sun crept low in the sky as Sterling continued their work. It was not until the shadows grew long and the light dimmed that they left the greenhouse. As they walked through the pasture, they noticed warm light seeping out from the window of their farmhouse, casting a soft glow out onto the fields. Sterling walked up to the porch and kicked off their boots, which were still caked with mud from their day's work. Their body ached. Hours hunched over garden baskets had twisted their spine and pulled their muscles in ways that no body should move. It was honest work, but it was hard. It wore away on them, and wore even harder on their ma. Sterling took a shallow breath and lifted their hand to the doorknob. They paused, noting the weighted feeling of Tobin's money in their pocket. Although rationally Sterling knew it was all in their mind, the cash felt like red-hot coals burning through their pants and into their flesh. With yet another breath, Sterling braced themselves and opened the door. The farmhouse consisted of 4 rooms, a small restroom, Ma's bedroom, an old storage area that had long been converted to fit a small bed for Sterling, and finally a modest living area, just big enough for their kitchen, a dining room table, and a large armoire.
Oh, welcome home, honey. I'm just about to serve up supper.
Sterling stepped into their home and paused. The door closing behind them solidified that this day and the money in their pocket was indeed real. Tobin, Etta, the fact that they just witnessed their last sunset in the east for God knows how long. Sterling did their best to shake off the anxiety and move to sit in the kitchen. They waited in silence as Ma carried steaming hot dishes to the table. Her deep chestnut hair was cut short, framing her face with gentle curls. Despite spending much of her day working on the farm, her features remained soft, while Sterling's hands calloused almost immediately. Their mother's always seemed smooth as the day she was born. Her hazel eyes were tender as she smiled at Sterling. They strained one in return and watched as their mother pulled a ceramic dish out of the oven. She turned, cheeks red from the heat, and set the dish down on the kitchen's small counter. After waving some of the steam away, Ma reached into her spice cabinet and began adding flavor to the meal.
Are you sure you don't need any help?
I'm fine. I'm just about finished.
It's no hassle, really.
If I needed help, I'd say so.
Sterling couldn't help but notice the twinge of grief in Ma's voice. She sounded tired, but Sterling knew not to ask her about it directly. She wasn't one to talk about her feelings much.
Right. What's for supper today?
Well, it turns out there was another infestation on the far end of the field. The stockman thinks it was some kind of rodent, voles or something along those lines. But that means the potatoes in the plot weren't fit to be sold, so the stockman offered them to us at a reduced price.
Sterling could tell she was trying to keep positive, despite news of yet another infestation. It had been happening more and more. Critters and bugs had ruined entire batches of crops, which meant even less money and demand for their produce. On top of it all, they could tell the charm of having natural-grown food was wearing off fast. The East no longer cared. Not that they did much before. They'd shove away any stench of the West they could manage. Once done with the final touches, Ma brought the dish to the dining room, setting it gently in front of Sterling. The ceramic was decorated with a floral design, intricately painted along it in hues of blues and pink. Within it, a heaping pile of golden cube potatoes still crackled with the heat from the wood oven. Sterling felt the pit in their stomach grow as they sat, waiting for Ma to join them at the table.
Here you go, darling.
Sterling's mother dished up supper for the two of them and began eating. Sterling eyed her, attempting to find the right thing to say before giving up and spooning the steaming potatoes into their mouth. The two ate in silence for what, to Sterling, felt like an eternity. Tobin's money still weighing in their pocket. As time crept on, the quiet became too much to stand.
I'll get my wages tomorrow. I can go into the city to purchase some meat to go along with the rest of our potatoes.
There's no need.
It's no trouble,
Sterling, we're okay.
Come on. Is this really what you dreamed we'd be doing when you left the West?
Sterling, you know how I feel about you bringing this up.
You used to tell me about your farm back there, your cattle and livestock, how you got to keep every penny of the beef and milk you sold, how your community stood together and looked after one another, took care of each other. What about Dad? You barely bring him up anymore as it is. What is so great about this place that it makes you want to forget everywhere else?
Sterling, don't.
You told me all those stories. For all those years. And yet you never told me why you left. I'm not trying to bring up painful memories, but I'm just so tired of being in the dark.
Ma sat her utensils down and cupped her face in her hands as heavy silence loomed over them. Even the ambient noises of cattle in the far pastures and crickets in the night seemed to have all but faded. Sterling attempted to speak up, to ask another question, to apologize, something. But every time they opened their mouth, it felt like it was full of honey. They watched as their mother's back rose and fell with deep breaths in an attempt to gain any semblance of composure.
When your father and I...
Sterling reached over and placed their hand on their mother's back. Her breathing was shaky and labored, as if she had just woken up from a bad dream.
I'm sorry,
No, you're right. You deserve some sort of explanation. I was just so scared. Centuries back, long before my time, or the time of your grandparents, the Eastern government decided that staying confined to this sliver of land wasn't, I believe the word they used was economical. Either way, the corporations pushed for expansion. The land out west was rumored to be full of gold, silver, other precious rock that they claimed they needed. They sent out expedition after expedition, and eventually, communities began to pop up and thrive deep in the west. Our ancestors were part of the very first community. That's where I was born, where I met your father, where I had you.
what was it like?
Ma's posture shifted as she reflected on her old home. After a moment, she let out a soft chuckle.
Oh, it was gorgeous. A tiny little place nestled in the crook of two mountains, next to a deep lake. In the mornings, mist would rise from its waters to create a deep fog that rolled through the community. If you got up and out to the lake early enough, you could sit and watch it rise. Your father and I did that a lot. But eventually, things started changing. It wasn't a place to start a family, to raise you. We made the difficult decision to leave.
In primary school, they told us it was hostile weather. Storms that raged on for months on end. Earthquakes and mine collapses that ruined communities. That's why they built the wall. Because it was no longer viable to maintain a connection to the West.
Everyone has ways to rationalize what happened out there. Weather, animals, madness. But I've never seen a prairie storm wipe a town off the map without a trace. Just like I've never seen a lone coyote rip a man to shreds. And the madness, it's only out there if you let it be. At the end of the day, the East made its decision to wall itself off, and your father and I, we made our decision to bring you here.
Ma.
It's hard thinking about him. But just because he didn't make it doesn't mean that you and I can't. We are hardworking, we are healthy, and we are safe. There is nothing for us, for you back there. Things are good for us here, don't forget that.
Sterling's mother pushed herself up from the table and began walking to her room.
I'm going to bed. Will you turn off the oil lamps when you head to sleep?
Of course. Good night, Ma.
Night, darling.
Ma looked back at them and attempted a comforting expression, her round cheeks dimpling ever so slightly. Sterling cracked a tired smile in return and waved their mother goodnight. They watched as she turned the corner and disappeared into her room, wishing they could have said more, wishing they asked more questions, told her how much they admired her bravery, wishing they were able to say a more meaningful goodbye. Sterling sat at the dinner table, unmoving, for longer than they would have liked. Every inch of them was howling to move, to get up and go, but somehow their limbs sat frozen. Eventually, hours after they'd watched their mother turn the corner into her room, and potentially out of their life, Sterling stood. They moved through the house in silence, gathering clothes and sparse belongings in a faded pack. Upon exiting their room, they passed their mother's door. Cracked open ever so slightly, the light of the moon pouring in from her window. She looked so peaceful, so unaware. Sterling stopped for a moment, contemplating waking her up, saying a proper goodbye. But the thought was quickly pushed from their mind.
I'll be back, Ma.
With a deep breath, they walked back into the living room and towards a large armoire in the corner. The doors creaked open with a puff of dust, revealing stacks upon stacks of worn books. Sterling's mother had been a proponent of the importance of literature, and although Sterling hadn't gone to university, their mother made sure that they had a healthy appreciation for reading and writing.
Come on, come on.
Sterling quietly rifled through stacks of old novels and biographies until finally, their hands wrapped around a threadbare leather journal. They lifted it into the light of the room's oil lamp, their fingers caressing its stitched binding and hand-stamped letters. Hastily, Sterling stuffed the book into their duffel and walked back towards the dining area. They pulled Tobin's envelope out of their pocket and set it on the dining room table. Pulling a charcoal pencil out of their pack, they scribbled a short note into the manila paper.
I got hired for some contract work. Some fancy fella up north. I'll be back as soon as I can. Until then, this is yours. It's more than enough to cover food and whatever else you may need. I love you. Sterling.
Sterling turned to leave, worrying that if they didn't exit the old farmhouse now, they never would. They opened the front door and stepped carefully onto the porch. Years of experience had taught them where the floorboards creaked and where they held strong. Carried as if by pure momentum, Sterling stepped off the porch and out into the darkness, their path illuminated by little more than the light of the moon. This was Mar Smith as Tobin, Mikayla Grubbs as Etta, Logyn Clair as Sterling, Brooklyn Kate as Ma, Owen Briggs as Mr. Clade, and Luana McTiernan as our narrator, with Alex Fryer, Jovan Jeffs, and Kyle J. Nelson as the recording techs. This episode was written and directed by Mar Smith and Mikayla Grubbs. Additional voices, contributors, and audio sources can be found in the episode description. This has been The Westward Eye. If you're a fan of what we're making here, please leave a review, share an episode with a loved one, and engage with our social media. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at The Westward Eye. Thank you for listening.